Hi everyone, and welcome back to The Flicks the Church Forgot. I'm Peter Laws. This is the second in a three-part episode looking at the mutant body in horror. In this episode, we look at the Basket Case Trilogy. Now, Second Sight are doing their bit for latex with an HD release of the Basket Case Trilogy. Now, even as a kid or a young teenager, I could tell that the original film, Basket Case, wasn't just a horror film. It was a cool horror film. It was edgy, it was rebellious and fresh. I'm not sure if that was the poster or because it was set in sleazy New York, but it just had this sort of punk edge to it, which I found very intriguing when I was a young guy, but also a little scary as well, like 10 or 11 or something, and seeing this poster. Now, just in case you're not familiar with these films, the trilogy tells the saga of twin brothers born attached to one another. Not attached at the hip as such, but more about here on the side. Anyway, one of them appears normal, in inverted commas, while the other is a fleshy growth with a face and an arm. These brothers are called Dwayne and Belial. No clues for guessing which might be which. Yes, the family in this film, I guess, took one look at the mutant son and decided to give it a biblically ominous sounding quasi-demonic name. You know, if your parents call you Belial, which is the Jewish word for devil from the Hebrew Bible, then you pretty much know something isn't quite right. Now, the original film shows Dwayne moving to a tatty New York apartment, carrying his brother in the basket. This is in the very early 1980s, so this would have been in the sort of heyday of the New York is the murder capital of the world type era. I do love that period of New York, with films like The Warriors and Escape from New York being ultra cool examples of a city that has lost control and has become something of a war zone. Here in Basket Case, though, the tension that we have isn't on an epic citywide scale. This is focused much more on this one apartment block and these two brothers trying to get along with their lives. The problem, however, for them, tragically, is no matter how much Dwayne thinks they can attempt a normal life, people tend to scream in horror whenever they see and set eyes on his monster brother. No wonder Belial starts getting a complex. Pretty soon he starts using his good hand to start ripping people's faces off. Now, it's a very interesting film. Pure exploitation, yes, but it's clever and it's subversive, and I think it would work just as well as a quirky, dark literary novel. It's a great example, I think, as well, of the sheer inventiveness of a director, how that can raise the bar on these sorts of low-budget films. You can tell there wasn't a lot of money spent on this, or could have been spent on this. The budget was quite low, but the director, Frank Henenlotter, pumped so much interesting ideas and quirky characters and moments of genuine pathos, and also cleverly unpleasant theatrical gore. Basket Case Part 2, which is featured in this set as well, is also kind of brilliant. The action of this one expands from the city into the country, where the convict brothers get taken in by a kindly lady wearing a bad grey wig. She's called Granny Ruth, and she runs a secretive but idyllic hostel for extremely deformed people. I hadn't actually seen this film before, but I must say I was pretty gripped by this. The story unfolds at a nice pace. The scenario is very unusual. The character of Granny Ruth is particularly unique and interesting, but it's actually a very thematically complex film, I felt. I watched the disaster movie San Andreas the other night, in the same week as I watched Basket Case, and that's the one starring The Rock, where everybody, he saves everybody from a massive earthquake leveling San Francisco. Now, I really enjoy big disaster movies, and I get a kick out of the mass destruction of it, but man, was it corny. And San Andreas was like, the CGI was so big on it, it was like playing a computer game rather than watching a film. But it was still fun in a popcorn sort of way. But I mentioned that because what I really noticed was how obvious and stereotypical the characters were in San Andreas. It was a very old school movie in the sense that you are made very aware of who the good guys are and who the bad guys are, so much so that the spoon feeding and hand holding can get annoying after a while. And I mentioned this within the context of Basket Case because when I watched the Basket Case movies in the same week as San Andreas, it was so noticeable how the Basket Case trilogy takes a very different and more nuanced approach to character. In other words, it's not easy to work out who the heroes and villains are in these films. Henenlotter doesn't feel compelled to tell you what to think. So the film, by extension, becomes more complex and more tricky to grasp, I guess. More isolating for some audiences, but I think therefore more intriguing. I enjoyed San Andreas in a spectacle popcorn way, but these two films are very different beasts and really good examples of different approaches. So in Basket Case 2, Hen and Lotta start subverting the ratios of the first film. In part 1, the fleshy head creature Belial was the deformed one, while everybody around him was relatively normal. Here, though, in Granny Smith's community of deformed people, Belial actually fits in perfectly. So now it's Dwayne, the normal brother, if you will, who starts feeling like the freak. They use that term quite a lot in these films, by the way, the term freak. So this company of freaks they bring on are really over the top, and yet they start in time to develop characters of their own. And after a while, they stop being so horrifying, or at least they did to me, and just appeared like quirky characters as part of this community. All this happy celebration of freakdom continues into part 3 as well, which is also featured on the set. Now, it's true that the Basket Case movies might have pure schlock moments. My wife walked in on me watching part 1, for example, where the scene was playing of Belial being separated from Dwayne in a very grotty scene, and she looked at the TV, she shook her head, and she said, "Oh, please." But it's part 2 that has perhaps the most gonzo and embarrassing scene of them all. Because at Granny Ruth's, Belial meets another flesh lump, and they fall in love. And bless them, after weeks of hand-holding, they have full-on sex in a cot. Just picture there's two fleshy hands and an arm getting it on. And when that scene came on, I remember I had my finger hovering over the chapter skip button just in case my wife walked in on me and saw me watching it, because she'd be calling the psychiatrist. However, my question is, why? Why should that be embarrassed? Why should that be disturbing to anyone? And this is what's so great about the Basket Case films, and to an extent, Yuzna's film Bride of Reanimator, which I reviewed in the first episode in this little mini-series. These films say, in some ways, if you find this repellent, maybe you've got the problem. You can't handle anyone that looks different, because the word freak is actually quite relative. Dwayne is the freak in part 2. And indeed, why on earth should Belial not beat someone who looks like him and get it on? And yet when we see it, there's this sort of internal prejudice that kicks in and says, these people look different. In fact, maybe they aren't even people at all, they're monsters, and monsters having sex is repulsive. Basket Case 2 suggests that actually maybe monsters may find us repellent. And if, for want of a better term, monsters, people who don't look like us. And if the people in Granny Ruth's community stumbled across a human porn movie, they might run to the toilet puking at how repulsive I am, or you are. Which leads me to the final film I'd like to cover in this episode on the mutant human, when we look at a fairly recent re-release of Todd Browning's career-ending sideshow picture, Freaks. Join me in the third and final episode for that.